The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Staff Sergeant James Cooper guided his dusty blue Ford F-150 down the winding forest road. The truck's GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, but the old-fashioned paper map in his lap hadn't failed him yet. After 3 hours of driving from Fort Bragg, the wooden sign for Pine Ridge Campground finally appeared around a bend. James hadn't planned on stopping at this particular campground. His original destination was another 2 hours ahead, but the growing headache from his recent concussion made him decide to call it a day. After 15 years in the Army Special Forces and 4 deployments, he had learned to listen to his body. The entrance to Pine Ridge opened up into a clearing surrounded by tall pines and old oaks. James noticed immediately that something was off about the atmosphere. The usual peaceful camping scene was disturbed by the loud rumble of motorcycle engines and heavy metal music blasting from somewhere deep in the campground. At the entrance booth, a young park attendant with nervous eyes handed him a map of the available sites. "Sir, I should mention that sites 12 through 15 are occupied by a large group," she said, her voice careful and measured. "Maybe you'd prefer something on the other side of the grounds." James gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll take Site 8, thank you." It was a strategic choice. Site 8 had a good view of both the entrance and the main camping area, with a thick cluster of trees providing cover on one side. As he drove through the campground, James took in the scene with practiced observation. 3 families were hastily packing up their sites, children looking disappointed as parents quickly folded camping chairs and dismantled tents. Near the back of the campground, 8 motorcycles were parked in a loose circle around 4 sites. Their owners, a rough-looking group of bikers in leather vests, were passing around bottles and laughing loudly. James pulled into Site 8 and turned off his engine. The spot was perfect, elevated slightly above the surrounding area, with clear sightlines in all directions. His years of setting up defensive positions had taught him to always look for tactical advantages, even on a simple camping trip. Opening his truck's rear door, James began unpacking with military efficiency. Everything had its place, and within 15 minutes, his campsite was properly arranged. A small 2-person tent, a folding chair, a compact cooking setup, and a bear-proof cooler, simple, practical, and easily packed if needed. The sound of motorcycles grew louder as 3 bikes slowly cruised past his site. James continued his work, but his trained peripheral vision caught every detail. 2 men and a woman, all wearing patches that read Forest Devils MC on their leather vests. They were sizing him up, taking in his military crew cut, his orderly campsite, and the Fort Bragg parking sticker on his truck. Well, looks like G.I. Joe's come camping," one of them called out, his voice carrying a mocking tone. James didn't react, continuing to drive his tent stakes into the ground with practiced moves. The bikers made another pass, slower this time. "Hey, soldier boy," a woman called out, "you sure you don't want to find another campground? This one might be too rough for you." Her companions laughed, their bikes' engines revving aggressively. James stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. He looked at them with calm, evaluating eyes. The same look he'd used countless times in villages and cities across 3 continents. Without saying a word, he gave them a small nod and turned back to his work. The bikers exchanged glances, slightly unsettled by his lack of response. They rode back to their group, where their story sparked loud laughter and increased the volume of their music. As darkness began to settle over the campground, James sat in his folding chair, eating a simple dinner of military MRE beef stew. He watched as the last family quickly packed up their minivan and left, leaving him alone with the biker group. Their party was getting louder, with occasional shouts and the sound of breaking bottles. James checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. Quiet hours started at 9:00 p.m. He had a feeling it was going to be an interesting night. After 15 years in Special Forces, he had developed a 6th sense for trouble. These bikers were looking for it, but they had no idea they'd chosen the wrong soldier to mess with. He quietly began making mental notes. 8 bikes, 11 people, 2 showing signs of serious combat training based on their movements, 3 clearly drunk, 2 acting as lookouts. Just another day at the office, he thought, as he began planning for every possible scenario. As 9:00 p.m. came and went, the bikers' party only grew louder. James sat quietly in the growing darkness, watching as they dragged picnic tables together and set up powerful portable speakers. The bass from their music vibrated through the ground, and their shouts echoed across the campground. At 9:30 p.m., James decided it was time for a professional approach. He stood up, pulled on his weatherproof jacket, and walked calmly toward their site. His movements were relaxed but purposeful, hands visible and away from his sides, the same way he'd approached countless tense situations overseas. As he got closer, the group noticed him. Some of them nudged each other, pointing and snickering. The biggest one, a tall man with a gray beard and arms covered in tattoos, stepped forward. James had already identified him as their leader during his earlier observations. "Can we help you with something, soldier boy?" the leader asked, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and challenge. The others formed a loose semicircle behind him. James stopped at a comfortable distance, close enough to talk normally, far enough to react if needed. "Evening, folks," he said politely. "It's past quiet hours. Would you mind turning down the music a bit? There might be other campers coming in late." This brought a round of laughter from the group. A younger biker with a shaved head stepped forward, swaying slightly from too many beers. "There ain't no other campers, military man. We scared them all away." More laughter followed. "That's right," added a woman with bright red hair, holding a beer bottle. "This is our campground now. Don't like the noise. Highway's that way." She pointed toward the exit with her bottle. James noticed several things during this exchange. Two of the bikers had stayed back, watching his hands and stance. They had military training, just as he'd suspected. Three others were too drunk to be a real threat. The leader was sizing him up carefully, probably used to judging potential threats. "Look," James said calmly, "I'm not looking for any trouble, just asking for some courtesy." The leader stepped closer, using his height to try to intimidate. "And what if we don't feel courteous tonight?" The smell of whiskey was strong on his breath. James held his ground, his expression neutral. "Then I'll head back to my site and call the ranger station. They can handle it officially." His voice remained professional, almost friendly. This triggered angry mutters from the group. The leader's face darkened. "You threatening us with the rangers, boy?" He moved even closer, his chest almost touching James's shoulder. James took a small step back, maintaining his personal space without showing fear. "Not a threat, sir. Just letting you know my next step if we can't work this out friendly-like." His southern accent came out a bit stronger, playing down any confrontational tone. The leader stared at him for a long moment, then burst out laughing. "Listen to this guy, sir, and friendly-like." He turned to his group. "Hey, maybe we should all join the army, learn some manners." More laughter followed, but James noticed the two ex-military bikers weren't joining in. They were watching him with growing recognition, perhaps finally placing his bearing and movements as Special Forces training. "Tell you what, soldier boy," the leader said, turning back to James. "We'll turn it down when we're good and ready. Maybe around sunrise." The group roared with laughter again. James nodded once, his face still calm. "Appreciate you hearing me out. You all have a good night." He turned and walked away, his back straight but not stiff, fully aware of the eyes following him. As he walked back to his site, he heard them mocking his polite departure, their voices getting louder just to spite him. The music volume increased, and someone revved their motorcycle engine repeatedly. Back at his campsite, James sat down in his chair and pulled out his phone. No signal, just as he'd expected. The ranger station was 10 miles away, and the nearest town was further. He was on his own, just like many times before in his career. He noticed two of the bikers had followed him partway, staying in the shadows of the trees. They were watching his site, probably planning something for later. James smiled slightly. They thought they were being stealthy, but to his trained eyes, they might as well have been holding flashing signs. As midnight approached, the party grew rowdier. James used the noise to cover the sound of him making preparations. If they decided to escalate things, he would be ready. Not with violence. He hadn't survived 4 deployments by rushing into fights. But 15 years in Special Forces had taught him there was always a smart way to handle any situation. He checked his watch again, 12:15 a.m. The real test would probably come around 2 o'clock a.m., when liquid courage and bad decisions usually peaked. James settled in for a long night, his mind already running through scenarios and solutions. Around 2:30 a.m., the noise from the bikers' camp finally started to die down. James hadn't slept, but he'd rested with his eyes closed, sitting upright in his truck's driver's seat. He'd learned long ago how to stay alert while appearing to be asleep. His camping chair was still outside, along with his cooler and some basic supplies. Looking like an easy target was part of his strategy. The first light of dawn was still hours away when James heard the sound he'd been expecting. Quiet footsteps trying to be stealthy. Through barely opened eyes, he watched three shadows moving between the trees. They were heading toward his campsite, using the darkness as cover. These weren't the ex-military bikers he'd spotted earlier. These three moved clumsily, emboldened by alcohol and bad judgment. James recognized them as the younger members of the group who had been the loudest during the confrontation. The trio reached his campsite, and James watched through his truck's tinted windows as they began their mischief. One of them, the skinny guy with a shaved head, opened his cooler and started removing items. Another, wearing a leather vest with no shirt underneath, pulled out a knife and began slashing James's camping chair. The third kept watch, nervously looking around but failing to notice James in his truck. "Look what Soldier Boy's got for dinner," the skinny one whispered too loudly, pulling out James's stored food. They started stuffing the packages into their pockets. "Man, this is boring," said the shirtless one, finishing his work on the chair. "Let's wake him up and have some real fun." He waved his knife, the blade catching a bit of moonlight. James had seen enough. He slowly opened his truck door on the opposite side, making sure it didn't make a sound. Years of training had taught him how to move silently, and the dew-dampened grass helped muffle his footsteps as he circled around behind them. The lookout was facing the wrong way, scanning the road instead of the shadows. James positioned himself near a large pine tree, listening to their whispered conversation. "His tent's over there," the lookout said, pointing. "Bet he's sleeping like a baby. Let's give Soldier Boy a wake-up call he won't forget," the skinny one snickered, dropping an apple core on the ground. Just then, a twig snapped under the shirtless one's boot. All three froze, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No crickets, no night birds, just silence. "Something ain't right," the lookout muttered, finally sensing the change in atmosphere. He turned around slowly, and his eyes widened as he saw James standing there, calm and collected. "Evening, gentlemen," James said softly, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Or I should say good morning." The three bikers spun around, bumping into each other in surprise. The shirtless one raised his knife, trying to look tough, but his hand was shaking. "You really shouldn't play with knives when you've been drinking," James said, his tone conversational but firm. "Lots of accidents can happen." "Back off, man," the skinny one shouted, his voice cracking. "There's three of us and one of you." James took one step forward, and all three took a step back. Something in his movement, the way he carried himself, made them suddenly uncertain. "Those are bad odds," James agreed. "For you." He kept his hands loose at his sides, ready but not threatening. "Now, we have two options here. First option, you put back everything you took, turn around, walk away, and we forget this happened." "Or what?" the shirtless one challenged, but his knife hand was dropping lower. "Or option two," James continued calmly, "we make noise. Lots of noise. Your friends back there," he nodded toward the bikers' camp. "They come running. Then they'll see you three, drunk and stealing, making them look bad. I'm guessing your boss with the gray beard doesn't like his people causing trouble without permission." The three looked at each other nervously. James had hit a nerve. They were clearly acting without their leader's approval. "You got 10 seconds to decide," James said, still in that calm voice. 10, 9. They didn't wait for him to reach 8. The skinny one practically threw the food back into the cooler. The knife clattered to the ground as they turned and hurried away, trying to act tough, but clearly relieved to be leaving. James waited until they were gone before picking up the knife. It was a cheap switchblade, barely sharp enough to cut his chair. He pocketed it and began carefully scanning the area, making sure they hadn't left any surprises behind. As he cleaned up the mess they'd made, James smiled slightly. Those three would keep quiet about what happened. Their pride wouldn't let them admit how easily he'd scared them off. But now they'd be wondering exactly who they were dealing with, and that uncertainty would work in his favor. The night was still young, and James suspected this was just the opening move in a longer game. He settled back into his truck, alert and ready. The real challenge would come when the whole group woke up and found out their youngest members had failed. Last edited 4 minutes ago. The morning sun was climbing higher when a forest ranger's truck pulled into the campground. James watched through his windshield as a woman in a dark green uniform stepped out. She was in her mid-40s, with her hair tied back in a tight bun, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew these woods well. The ranger stopped first at the bikers' camp, where most of the group was still sleeping off their late night. Only their leader and 3 others were awake, sitting around a smoking campfire. James couldn't hear their conversation, but he could read the body language. The ranger was firm but cautious, and the bikers were putting on their best behavior. After a few minutes, she walked toward James's sight. He stepped out of his truck to greet her, standing respectfully as she approached. "Good morning, sir," she said, her badge reading Ranger Sarah Martinez. "Just doing my morning rounds. Everything okay at your site?" James nodded, then glanced at his slashed camping chair. The ranger followed his look and frowned. "When did this happen?" she asked, taking out a small notebook. "Had some late-night visitors around 2:30 a.m., James replied quietly. 3 of the younger ones from that group. They went through my cooler too, but I convinced them to put everything back." Ranger Martinez's eyebrows went up. "You confronted them?" "More like had a peaceful conversation," James said with a slight smile. "No violence, just words." The ranger studied him for a moment, then looked down at her notebook. "You military?" "Yes, ma'am. Special Forces." She nodded as if something made sense now. "Well, Staff Sergeant, I'm assuming by your bearing, I should warn you about that group. They call themselves the Forest Devils NC. They've been causing trouble up and down the state parks for the past month." James listened as she continued, her voice dropping lower. "They started in Georgia, worked their way up through South Carolina, and now they're here in North Carolina. Same pattern at each campground. They show up, intimidate other campers until they leave, then trash the place before moving on. 3 parks have reported stolen camping gear, vandalism, and harassment." "Why haven't they been arrested?" James asked, though he could guess the answer. "No one's willing to file charges," she explained, frustration clear in her voice. "Families just want to leave quickly and safely. Can't blame them. We tried increasing patrols, we're short-staffed, and these parks cover a lot of ground." James nodded, understanding the situation. It was similar to problems he dealt with overseas. A group of bullies taking advantage of people's fear and the authorities' limited resources. "The 3 who came to your site," Ranger Martinez said, looking at her notes again, "can you describe them?" James gave her detailed descriptions of the 3 bikers, including their clothing, approximate heights and weights, and distinguishing features. The ranger looked impressed at his observation skills. "That matches descriptions from other parks," she said. "Especially the one with no shirt and the switchblade. He seems to enjoy destroying property." Speaking of which, James reached into his truck and pulled out the knife they dropped. They left this behind. The ranger took it carefully, putting it in an evidence bag. "This helps. Not enough for an arrest, but it adds to our documentation." She looked back at the bikers' camp, where more of them were starting to wake up. "I'd offer to move you to another campground, but something tells me you won't accept." James smiled. "You're right about that. Someone needs to stand up to bullies." "Just be careful," she warned. "These guys aren't your typical troublemakers. 2 of them have serious criminal records, and their leader, the big guy with the gray beard, he's got a history of assault charges." "Appreciate the warning," James said, "but I've handled worse." Ranger Martinez handed him a card with her number on it. "I'll have a patrol car drive by every couple of hours, but cell service is spotty out here. If things get bad, there's an emergency radio at the entrance booth. It's about half a mile from your site." James pocketed the card, noting the ranger's genuine concern. "Thank you, ma'am." As she walked back to her truck, she turned one last time. "You know, most people would have packed up and left by now." "Most people haven't spent 15 years dealing with bullies in other countries," James replied quietly. The ranger smiled and nodded before driving away. James watched her truck disappear down the forest road, then turned his attention back to the bikers' camp. They were all awake now, and by their gestures and looks in his direction, they were definitely talking about him. The real test would come soon, and James needed to be ready. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had risen, and so had the tension in the campground. James watched from his sight as the Forest Devils began their usual intimidation routine with 2 new families who had just arrived. First, They revved their motorcycles repeatedly as the families tried to set up their tents. Then, they started playing their music at full volume, pointing the speakers directly at the newcomers' sights. The final touch was walking past the families' camps in groups, making threatening comments just loud enough to be heard. James observed it all while preparing his own site for what he knew would come later. He'd seen this kind of systematic intimidation before, though usually in war zones with much higher stakes. The technique was the same: create fear, show power, and break down resistance. One family lasted only 45 minutes before packing up their minivan and leaving. The father looked ashamed as he hurried his wife and two young kids into the car, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The bikers celebrated their departure with loud cheers and more revving engines. The second family held out longer, but when the bikers started throwing empty beer cans near their children playing by the picnic table, they too gave up and left. James noticed the mother crying as they drove away, their half-set-up tent left behind in their rush to leave. This seemed to embolden the forest devils even more. The leader, who James had heard others call Rex, gathered his group for what looked like a planning session. Even from a distance, James could tell they were discussing him. Several members kept pointing in his direction and making aggressive gestures. Using techniques he'd learned in special forces, James had already prepared his site for different scenarios. His truck was parked for a quick exit if needed, but positioned to block any vehicles trying to enter his site. He'd cleared the ground of anything that could be used as a weapon and mapped out all possible approach routes through the trees. Around 4 p.m., the two ex-military bikers James had noticed earlier walked over to his site. They moved differently than the others. More disciplined, more aware of their surroundings. One had a Marine Corps tattoo on his neck, the other walked with the slight stiffness of someone with an old combat injury. "Afternoon," the one with the Marine tattoo said. "Mind if we talk?" James nodded, staying seated but keeping his hands visible. "Go ahead." "Look, we know what you are," the Marine said quietly. "That move you pulled last night with the young guys, that was straight out of the Special Forces playbook." "We're trying to warn you," the other one added. "Rex isn't happy about last night. Those three idiots told him they got scared off by a crazy soldier, and now he thinks he has to prove something." James studied them carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" The Marine shifted uncomfortably. "Because we don't want any part of what's coming. We joined this group to ride bikes and have fun, not to bully families and fight Special Forces operators." "We've seen enough fighting," his friend agreed. "But Rex and most of these guys, they're just thugs looking for trouble, and they're planning something big for tonight." James nodded slowly. "I appreciate the warning, but you know I can't leave." The two bikers exchanged glances. "Yeah, we figured you'd say that," the Marine said. "Just try not to hurt them too badly. Some of these guys have families." "I don't plan to hurt anyone," James replied calmly, "but I won't let them keep terrorizing people either." As the two bikers walked away, James noticed Rex watching the interaction from his camp. The biker leader's face was dark with anger. Clearly, he didn't like his men talking to the enemy. Over the next few hours, James watched the group prepare for their night's entertainment. They drank heavily, worked themselves up with aggressive music, and kept looking his way with increasing hostility. Rex seemed to be giving instructions, pointing to different areas around James's site. James used the time to make his own preparations. He knew they would wait until dark, thinking it would give them an advantage. But darkness had been his ally in countless operations, and tonight would be no different. As the sun began to set, James heard Rex's voice carry across the campground. "Tonight, we teach Soldier Boy what happens when he messes with the forest devils." James allowed himself a small smile. They still didn't understand what they were dealing with, but they would learn soon enough. Just after midnight, a light rain began falling on Pine Ridge Campground. The soft patter of drops on leaves helped mask any sounds, creating perfect conditions for what was about to unfold. James sat silently in the darkness behind his truck, watching the bikers camp through his military-grade night vision monocular. He kept this piece of equipment from his last deployment, and tonight it would prove useful. Through the green-tinted view, he could see 6 bikers still drinking around their fire, while Rex and 4 others were having a hushed discussion near the trees. The 2 ex-military bikers were nowhere to be seen. They had left the campground hours earlier, wanting no part in what was coming. James respected their decision. They had recognized what their friends couldn't. That military training wasn't about muscles or fighting skills, but about strategy and patience. At 12:30 a.m., the first phase of the bikers' plan began. Two of them started their motorcycles and rode out of the campground, making a show of leaving. James knew better. They were positioning themselves on the access road to block any escape attempts. Through his monocular, he watched Rex point toward different areas around James's campsite, sending his men to surround it. They moved clumsily through the wet darkness, thinking they were being stealthy, but making enough noise to wake half the forest. James's tent was set up prominently in the center of his site, with a battery-powered lantern creating a shadow inside that looked like someone sleeping. It was an old trick he'd used many times before, and the bikers fell for it completely. Rex's voice carried through the rain in a loud whisper. "Remember, we rough him up just enough to make him leave. No permanent damage. We don't need murder charges." James almost smiled at their overconfidence. They still thought this was going to be a simple beatdown of a lone soldier. In their minds, 11 against 1 were good odds. But they didn't understand that those odds meant they would just get in each other's way in the darkness. 3 bikers approached the tent from the front, while 2 more circled around back. Another 3 spread out in the trees, probably thinking they were covering all escape routes. Rex and his right-hand man stayed back, watching what they thought would be an easy victory. James remained perfectly still as they got into position. The rain had picked up slightly, reducing visibility even more. None of them noticed that the sleeping shadow in the tent hadn't moved once, or that it was slightly too rigid to be real. "Now," Rex commanded in a harsh whisper. The 3 bikers at the front of the tent rushed forward, while the 2 at the back pulled out knives to slash through the fabric. But as they reached the tent, James was already moving. He stepped out from behind his truck, moving silently on the wet grass. The first biker never saw him coming. James simply placed 2 fingers on a pressure point in the man's neck, and he dropped without a sound, not hurt, just temporarily unable to move. The second biker turned at the sound of his friend falling, but James was already past him. A quick strike to the back of the knee, and another biker was on the ground, more surprised than hurt. The third man managed to shout "behind you," before James used a simple arm lock to guide him face first into a tree trunk. Not hard enough to injure, just enough to disorient. The 2 bikers with knives had just finished slashing the empty tent when they realized something was wrong. They spun around to find James standing between them, calm as could be in the rain. "Evening, gentlemen," he said softly. "Might want to put those knives down before someone gets hurt." One of them lunged forward with his knife, but James simply wasn't there anymore. The biker's momentum carried him forward into his friend, and they both slipped on the wet grass. Rex's voice boomed through the darkness. "What's going on up there?" But none of his men could answer. 5 of them were already on the ground, unhurt but thoroughly defeated by a combination of simple martial arts moves and their own confusion. The 3 bikers in the trees started moving forward, but they were unsure now. The rain had hidden the quick takedowns from their view, and all they could see were their friends mysteriously down on the ground. James stood quietly in the darkness, rain dripping from his hair, waiting for the next move. The night was still young, and he had plenty more lessons to teach. Rex's angry voice cut through the rain. "Someone turn on some lights. I want to see what's happening." The remaining 3 bikers in the trees fumbled with their flashlights, their hands shaking from a mixture of rain, alcohol, and growing fear. When the beams finally cut through the darkness, they revealed a scene none of them had expected. 5 of their toughest members were on the ground, groaning and confused but largely unhurt. The slashed tent lay empty, its contents completely dry. It had never been used. And standing calmly in the middle of the chaos was James, hands relaxed at his sides, rain dripping from his military jacket. "This isn't a fight you want," James said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the rain. "Pack up your bikes and leave the campground. Find a new hobby that doesn't involve terrorizing families." Rex stepped forward into the light, his massive frame trying to look intimidating. "You think you can tell us what to do? This isn't the army, soldier boy. No rules out here." James didn't move. "There are always rules. You just haven't learned them yet." This enraged Rex, who charged forward like an angry bull. But James had fought bigger men in worse conditions. As Rex threw a heavy punch, James simply stepped aside, using the biker's own momentum to guide him face first into the mud. Rex's right-hand man, a heavily tattooed biker named Snake, pulled out a chain and started swinging it. "You're dead, military man." James watched the chain's movement with practiced eyes. He trained against weapons like this in dozens of countries. The rain made the chain slippery, and Snake's grip wasn't properly secured. When Snake swung the chain, James stepped inside its arc. His hand shot out, caught the chain mid-swing, and with a simple twist, yanked it from Snake's grasp. The chain fell harmlessly to the ground. "That's enough," Rex shouted, struggling to his feet, mud covering his beard. "Everyone get him at once." The three bikers from the trees rushed forward, while Snake and Rex came at James from different angles. But the tight space and rain worked against them. They got in each other's way, slipping on the wet grass, their attacks uncoordinated. James moved like water through their clumsy assault. He didn't throw a single punch. He didn't need to. Instead, he used their own energy against them, redirecting attacks, stepping aside at just the right moment, letting them crash into each other. One biker slipped and fell face first trying to grab James. Another swung wildly and hit his own friend instead. Snake lunged forward, but ended up hugging a tree as James smoothly sidestepped. Within minutes, all 5 attackers were on the ground again, some tangled with each other, others face down in the mud. None were seriously hurt, just exhausted, confused, and thoroughly humiliated. Rex made one final attempt to stand, his face red with rage and embarrassment. Who are you?" "Just a soldier who's seen enough bullying," James replied calmly. "Now, I've been polite so far. Nobody's hurt, nothing's broken except my tent, which you'll be paying for. But if you want to continue this, I can stop being polite." The quiet confidence in his voice finally broke through their bravado. The bikers who had been taken down earlier were slowly getting up, none making any move to restart the fight. They looked at their leader, waiting for his decision. Rex looked around at his defeated crew, then back at James, who hadn't even broken a sweat despite the rain. For the first time, real fear showed in the biker leader's eyes. "This isn't over," Rex muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," James said firmly. "Because if it isn't, my next call is to the state police. The ranger gave me some interesting information about warrants out for several members of your group. Plus, I got photos of everything you've done at this campground. Your choice." The fight was gone from their eyes now. One by one, the bikers backed away, helping their friends up, all of them avoiding James's steady gaze. "You have 1 hour to pack up and leave," James said. "I suggest you use it wisely." As the defeated group stumbled back to their camp, James heard one of them mutter, "Man, we picked the wrong soldier to mess with." James stood in the rain, watching them retreat. The night wasn't over yet, but the worst of it was done. Sometimes the best victories were the ones where nobody got seriously hurt, a lesson he'd learned well in Special Forces. The rain had stopped by the time Ranger Martinez's truck pulled into the campground at dawn. She wasn't alone. 2 state police cars followed behind her, their lights flashing silently in the early morning mist. James watched from his sight as the vehicles parked near the bikers' camp. The Forest Devils had spent the last few hours packing up, their usual noisy behavior replaced by sullen silence. Every time they glanced in James's direction, they quickly looked away, their earlier confidence completely shattered. Ranger Martinez walked over to James first, taking in the scene, the slashed tent, the muddy ground showing signs of the night's confrontation, and James himself, looking as calm as if he'd just finished a morning jog. "Got an interesting call from 2 of them," she said, nodding toward the bikers. "Former military guys. They told me everything, the harassment at other campgrounds, the stolen equipment, the planned attack on you. They couldn't live with what the group was doing anymore." James nodded. "Good men who fell in with the wrong crowd. It happens. They'd also mentioned something about you handling the situation last night." The ranger raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Just a brief discussion about campground etiquette," James replied with a slight smile. "No serious injuries, though they might have some bruised egos." The state police officers were now walking through the bikers' camp, checking IDs and taking notes. Rex and his gang stood in a group, looking much less intimidating in the morning light. Some had mud still caked in their clothes from their failed attack. "We found stolen camping gear in their vehicles," Ranger Martinez continued. "Matches reports from 3 other state parks. Plus, 2 of them have outstanding warrants. They won't be bothering any more campers for a while. As they watched, the police began handcuffing Rex and Snake. The other bikers were being separated into groups, some being arrested, others just getting citations. The 2 veterans gave us written statements, the ranger added. They're willing to testify about everything they've witnessed. In exchange, they'll get immunity from prosecution. One of the police officers walked over with an evidence bag. Inside was camping equipment that had been stolen from the families who fled yesterday. Sir, the officer said to James, we found your slash tent fabric in their trash. We'll need it for evidence, but the Parks Department will reimburse you for the damage. James waved off the offer. Give it to one of the families they chased away. I've got spare equipment. More police cars arrived, along with a tow truck for the motorcycles that would be impounded. The morning was filled with the sound of official reports being made and vehicles being loaded. Some of the bikers who weren't being arrested started their motorcycles to leave. As they rode past James's site, they kept their eyes straight ahead, their earlier bravado replaced by shame. Rex, sitting in the back of a police car, caught James's eye one last time. The biker leader's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. He still couldn't understand how one soldier had dismantled his entire operation without throwing a single punch. You know, Ranger Martinez said, watching the scene unfold, most people would have just called the police right away. James shook his head. They would have scattered before you arrived. Sometimes you need to let people show their true colors before justice can work. A family in a large RV pulled into the campground, looking nervous at all the police activity. The ranger went to explain the situation and assure them it was safe now. As James began packing up his own site, he found the cheap switchblade that had been used to slash his tent. He picked it up, thinking about how simple weapons could cause so much trouble in the wrong hands, and how the most effective weapon was often the mind. One of the state police officers approached him for a final statement. Sir, we'd like to know exactly what happened last night. James looked at the money ground, the torn tent, and the defeated bikers being led away. Just a quiet night of camping, he said with a slight smile, though I believe the Forest Devils learned an important lesson about choosing their targets more carefully. The morning sun was getting stronger now, burning away the mist and revealing a peaceful campground once again. In a few hours, new families would arrive, unaware of the night's events. They would enjoy their camping trip without fear of harassment or intimidation. Sometimes, James thought, the best victories were the ones that went untold, where peace was restored without fanfare or recognition. It was something he'd learned well in Special Forces, and it had served him just as well here in a simple forest campground. A week later, Pine Ridge Campground had returned to its peaceful state. The weekend was in full swing, with families enjoying the natural beauty that had drawn them there. Children played near the lake, bikes rode safely along marked trails, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter instead of motorcycle engines. James sat at a new picnic table, sipping his morning coffee. He had decided to stay a few extra days, wanting to make sure the campground returned to normal. Ranger Martinez had given him a prime spot near the lake as a thank you, though he hadn't asked for any recognition. Excuse me, sir, a small voice called out. James looked up to see a young boy, maybe 10 years old, standing nervously nearby. Behind him, at their campsite, his father watched carefully while preparing breakfast. Are you the soldier everyone's talking about? The boy asked. The one who stopped the bad bikers. James smiled gently. I'm just a camper who believes in peaceful camping, that's all. The boy's eyes widened with admiration. My dad says you're a hero. We tried camping here 2 months ago, but those bikers scared us away. Now we're back, and it's awesome. More families had indeed returned to Pine Ridge. Word had spread quickly through the camping community that the Forest Devils were gone. The ranger station reported that bookings had doubled, with many families feeling safe enough to return to outdoor activities. Later that morning, a familiar truck pulled up. Ranger Martinez stepped out, carrying some papers in her hand. She walked over to James's site with good news. Thought you want to know the outcome, she said, sitting down across from him. Rex and 4 others are facing serious charges, not just for the campground incidents, but for other crimes they committed across 3 states. They'll be away for a while. James nodded, listening as she continued. The 2 veterans who came forward? They're doing well. One's working with a program helping former military members readjust to civilian life. The others become a volunteer at state parks, using his experience to help improve security. Good to hear, James replied. Sometimes people just need a push in the right direction. The ranger handed him a letter. The parks department wanted to offer you a job as a security consultant. They're impressed with how you handled the situation without violence or property damage. Well, except for your own tent. James smiled but shook his head. Thank you, but I prefer keeping things quiet. Besides, I'm still active duty, just needed some peaceful camping between assignments. As the day progressed, more families arrived for the weekend. James watched as they set up their sites, children running around excitedly, parents relaxing in camping chairs. This was how a campground should be, a place for families to connect with nature and each other. Near sunset, James packed up his remaining gear. His leave was ending, and duty called. As he loaded the last items into his truck, he noticed something that made him smile. A family was setting up camp in the same spot where the forest devils had parked their motorcycles. Where once there had been intimidation and fear, now there were children putting up a tent with their parents' help. Ranger Martinez came by one last time as he was preparing to leave. You know, she said, I've got 15 years of park service experience, but I learned something new from you this week. Sometimes the quietest solution is the most effective. James nodded. That's what Special Forces taught me. The best victories are often the ones that nobody hears about. As he drove out of Pine Ridge Campground, James caught glimpses of the peaceful scenes in his rearview mirror. Families gathered around campfires, children playing tag between the trees, couples walking hand in hand along the lake shore. The forest had returned to what it was meant to be, a sanctuary for people seeking peace in nature. He thought about Rex and his gang, hoping they would learn from their experience. Sometimes it took being defeated by a quiet professional to understand that true strength wasn't about intimidation or violence. James smiled as he turned onto the main road. His next deployment would come soon enough, with its own challenges and missions. But for now, he was content knowing that one small corner of the world was a little more peaceful because he'd chosen to camp there. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles were won not with weapons or violence, but with patience, strategy, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing when to stand your ground. Pine Ridge Campground would remember that lesson for a long time to come.